thank everyone for being here and just give appreciation to Carolyn Holbrook for creating this space for us in Minneapolis for us to celebrate Black women's writing and specifically Black women Caribbean writers. So let's just give her a hand again. And I would like to, thank the law for, holding this kind of forum for folks who write for a living, people who would like to write for a living, people who have written and would like to learn how to write again. It's a real jewel and a resource for the Twin Cities to have this space. So much appreciation to the Loft as well. So first, I just want to just talk a little bit about the question of diaspora and our connections across diaspora as Black people and as Black writers. Often when we think about Black women, we like to think of us as being stuck within a particular place, but that, I think, flies in the face of our history, right? Black women have traveled as a result of forced movement and mobility, but also as a way in which to practice our own sense of freedom. And so to talk about Black women writers and Caribbean women writers, we also have to talk about how it is that travel and mobility have shaped our collective subjectivities, but also our collective consciousness. I'm not supposed to be lecturing, I'm supposed to be reading. But I just thought this was the only way I knew how to make sense of this. And so I want to share a poem by M. Norbeze Phillips, who's a Canadian woman writer from Tobago's. And one of the ways in which she's kind of pulled together and made us think about our connectivity across the diaspora is by thinking about how it is in which, our first crossings, right? The crossings over the Atlantic, the kind of submerged ways of knowing and existing that happened while we were at the bottom of those ships, floating, and sometimes even at the bottom of these kind of oceans, namely the Atlantic Ocean. And so I want to share with you a poem by Phillips, and it's simply called Zong Number 5. Of water, rains, and dead, the more of Negroes of water and weeks, 3 less than, rains and water, 3 buts good of sea and perils of water, 1 day, water, day 1 of months, of weeks, of days, of sustenance, lying dead, of days of sour water enemies, and want of died, 7 out of 17, of good, the more of 18 instead of 6, dead of rains, 11 days of weeks, 30, not 3, of water, day 1, for sustenance, water, day 1, 1 day's water, day 1, sour water, day 1, 3 buts good of voyage, a month's of necessity, sufficient, and last, the more of exist, want, and less than, of did not, and the more of suffered, did not exist, sustenance, water, and want of dead, the more of Negroes, the more of instead of.
Thank you so much, Zanzelli. Another hand for Zanzelli, please. Oh, and I forgot to thank Anna Min, our fabulous photographer. So everybody knows Anna rocks, so. All right. Okay, it is now my pleasure to introduce Carolyn Holbrook. Carolyn Holbrook is a writer, educator, longtime advocate for the healing arts, for the power of healing arts. Her passion for providing grassroots accessibility to the literary arts inspired her to create SASSY, The Right Place. As the head of SASSY, she started the Verve Grants, the first spoken word artist grants in the nation. As well, she has started the SASSY Jerome Grants, now the Beyond the Pure, after SASSY's merger with Intermedia Arts in 2006. She and her amazing team also started SASSY About Town reading series. This includes the Queer Voices reading, curated by Andrea Jenkins and John Medeiros, and the Carol Connolly reading, as well as the Banfield Locke reading series. In 2005, she designed the Givens Foundation for African American Literature's Writers in the Schools program. In 2010, she was awarded the Minnesota Book Awards Case Sexton Award for long-standing dedication and outstanding work in fostering books, reading, literary activities in Minnesota. Her essays and short stories have been published widely. In 2013 and in 2015, her book, Ordinary People, Extraordinary Journeys, How the St. Paul Company's Leadership Initiatives and Neighborhoods Program Changed Lives and Communities, was released. Still giving to emerging writers, she teaches creative writing and composition at Hamline University and Minneapolis Community and Technical College, and she is serving as the local creative nonfiction mentor right here at the Loft for the Mentor Series. Can we please give an exuberant welcome and thank you to Carolyn Holbrook.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming today. Even though we know the marathon's going on, or is it done now? It's done. So, all right. So, if you were here last Sunday for the African American women writers panel, you know that the seed for this series began when my writing group, Twin Cities Black Women Writing, did a reading at Birch Bark Books several years ago. An audience member's comment that she was surprised that we were all so different made me want to someday make a contribution toward changing the perception that lumps Black people together as though there's only one voice that we speak from, as though there's only one Black experience. I'm grateful to have the opportunity for this series to follow my dream of helping to dispel the myth of the single story, thanks to the Loft and the Artist Initiative grant that I received this year from the Minnesota State Arts Board, which Sherry mentioned. One of the requirements of the Artist Initiative grant is that recipients have to do a public event. And initially, I thought that I would just do 2 readings, one in Minneapolis and one in St. Paul, with members of my writing group and some students. But last spring, I attended a really powerful panel right here in this room, where David Mira conducted a panel with young spoken word artists, and I was really inspired to do something more than just a reading. So as a side note, the novelist Junot Diaz speaks of David Mira as a Jedi master. When I saw that, I said, yeah. Yeah. So thank you, David, for the work you do guiding and mentoring all of us. I forgot my laser sword, but you know, hey. So, thanks also to the editors and the publishers of Blues Vision, a beautiful and important anthology of Minnesota African American writers, the first to be published in 30 years. This book also contributed to my desire to have these discussions. There are still loads of events around Blues Vision that are going on, even though the book was published last spring. And as I mentioned last week, I wanted to focus on the women in the book. But the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to hear the voices also of Black women living in Minnesota who are not in Blues Vision and who are from the African diaspora, whose identities are rooted in places outside of the United States. Conversations with Bao Fee and Sherry Fernandez-Williams here at the Loft informed me of their As Curated program, which has given me amazing support for this panel series in multiple ways. Thank you, Bao and Sherry. Let's give it up for them again. And also to Elena Anderson, a former student of mine from Hamlin who is an intern here now. She created the slideshow, I almost said slideshow, and the programs that you're holding. And Josh and his crew for doing the video. Marianne Combs is going to put some of this on NPR. We'll let you know when it's going to air. And then Ibrahim Hersey did a beautiful article for MinPost on last week's program. I don't know if he's in the room today. But that was a beautiful article. And then I want to give a huge shout out also to Lori Herzl, books editor of the Star Tribune, for the amazingly sensitive article she did last week. And her photographer, Brian Peterson, did this amazing portrait of 3 of the women in the series. So, if you have not seen Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie's powerful TED Talk, I know I said her name wrong, I'm sorry, but I hope y'all know who I'm talking about. The TED Talk is The Danger of a Single Story. If you haven't seen it, I urge you to do so. Among other things, she says, so that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing and one thing only over and over again, and that is what they become. She also says it's impossible to talk about a single story without talking about power, because power is the ability to not just tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. She quotes a Palestinian poet whose name I know I'm going to mess up. I'm sorry again. I'll spell it, M-O-U-R-D. The last name is B-A-R-G-H-O-U-T-I. She quotes this poet who writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. And I'm going to add, you start the story with the achievement gap, teen pregnancy, the incarceration rate of African-American men, and not the Dutch slave ship man of war that landed in Virginia in 1619, you will have a different story. And if you start with poverty and destitution in the Caribbean nations and not with the arrival of the slave ships to the island of Hispaniola, which was the birthplace of the black experience in the Americas, the first place in the New World to import Africans as slaves, you will definitely have a different story. Today we're going to hear from 3 women whose identities are closely tied to the Caribbean islands of Haiti and Trinidad. As Sherry Fernandez-Williams pointed out, you have their full bios in the program. What she didn't point out is that she also has Caribbean roots. Her mother was Cuban. Her maternal line is Cuban. But I'll just call the ladies up to the stage. Valerie Diaz. Val, yeah. Is Baudelaine Pierre here? She's coming from the other direction. And Janata Petrus. So just like last week, I still have some stuff going on with my hips. So you're going to see me standing and sitting and standing and sitting, but your focus is going to be on them anyway, so who cares what I do, right? Okay, so as pointed out already, you already have their bios on the program. So we're just going to start by asking each one of you to introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about yourself, and why you think this conversation is important. And we'll start with Janata.
Right on. My name is Janata Petrus, and I'm a writer. I think most deeply as an artist, I'm a writer. I'm also a performance artist. I do aerial art, circus arts, playwriting, installation art. I like to do everything. And why this conversation is important?
Why do you think this conversation is important? Yeah.
Well, I think it's cool to connect with the, oh, that's such a big question. I'm very proud to be of Caribbean heritage. I very much am also proud to be a person who's Black American and has really identified with the Black experience via my roots in the Caribbean. And I think it's good to sort of hear this sort of very intricate voice in the way that it experiences the juxtaposition of being from an island, someplace very remote and kind of isolated in its own very rich culture, which I think every island has that in common, even if it's this big or, you know, huge, as well as seeing that in the context of this wintry Minnesotan experience. You know what I mean? I think it's a very important conversation for that.
All right. Baudelaire.
Is it okay if I stand up?
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like being the tallest here, so. Yeah, hi everyone. Actually, I had quite a busy day and it was like an adventure. And before coming here, I had to text a few friends to ask them for directions. And I have 2 kids, a 9-year-old girl and my son is 6-year-old, so they drive me around a lot. So I had to drive them to their places, and I think this is what my life is about. It's always busy and sometimes it's hard to find time to write, but I enjoy it. And I was thinking about the people I have invited and the people that were coming. I was, wow, I have to make it, and I'm glad I am here. And I think we were talking about canon and in literature, and I think what we are doing here is to build a collective story. And sometimes we talk about canon and we talk about some criteria. We talk about some ways of building something in literature, for instance, and in privileging particular stories. And if we're talking about the story of our communities, I think it does make sense to have conversations and to build stories together. And I think it makes sense to be here and to have this conversation with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. And Valerie?
Hi, this is Valerie. For me, this conversation is important because, let me tell you a little bit about myself. So, okay, I was born in New York. I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in this really deep sort of Haitian community. So everyone I knew was Haitian. So it was, for me, the experience of being here and talking about this, I think the diaspora is really important to me, being able to make those connections with, or sort of seeing the similarities across the world, to sort of see that we are all in the same type of struggle, even though they might be different in different ways, but essentially it's similar. And I think it's also important to be able to cross those borders and make those connections with each other. I think that a lot of times, especially being in the US, the story feels like it's always about the US. And I often feel sort of like, well, you know, there's a lot more stuff going on everywhere else. I don't want to be that person to point it out, but it feels very hard to sort of get that different opinion in a sense, or get that different voice in. But I think it's important for us to see that we all have this, we all are sort of struggling in the same place, and it's important for us to start working together and start connecting and start seeing our connections, even though we're different. I just think it's important.
Yeah. All right, thank you. So, as you guys mentioned, you all come from different backgrounds. Even though your roots are in the Caribbean, you're from different parts of the Caribbean. and you've told us a little bit about yourselves as well. So let me ask you how your personal identity informs your writing. What issues do you write about? What issues do you avoid writing about? What issues do you fear writing about? And why? Let me add one more. What do you need to write about? And why? And also, because next one's just a statement, not a question. Just a reminder that NPR is recording this, so when you speak, just say your name, okay?
Right, thanks for reminding
All
us.
right. So anybody just dive in with that one.
This is Valerie. For me, what I was thinking about this question this morning, and the things that I feel like I don't write about or I have trouble writing about, and that's the reason why I don't write about them, is trauma. I often want to, and I feel like it's going to happen, and then it starts to just become me retelling a story. I think it just takes a lot of time for me to process trauma, and whatever they may be. And so I have difficulty writing about it in a way that makes it make sense to me. So I'm the type of person, so if something happened, I will write about it on the anniversary over and over again, but it's always the same story of what happened until one day it becomes a different story or it becomes a different form in a sense. And so it's a little vigil that I keep about certain events, about certain things, to sort of not necessarily just keep the memory alive, but sort of remind myself that this thing happened, and one day you'll be able to say something else about it, but this is all you can say about it right now. So I just continue to say that until it changes.
And Valerie, I've noticed that in our writing group,
Yes.
whenever you speak about the things that you're trying to get out of your heart and onto the page, there's this sort of overwhelming sense of homesickness that comes from you. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, for me, so growing up in the 80s, when my parents, so my parents came from Haiti in the early 70s. They met in Brooklyn, so they met there and then started dating, and then I was born, and here I am. But there was always this sort of talk in my house about going back. So the whole idea was sort of like, we're gonna come here, we're gonna work hard and make some money, and we're gonna go back to Haiti. But the political climate in Haiti never made that possible. So it's like years go by and you never get that connection to return. And so it sort of ended up being people, instead of us going back, people started coming in. And so then we have a lot of family that comes in, but then you still have family at home, and there's this disconnection, and people have grown, and time has passed, and it's sort of, I'm a little choked up about it now. But it's, you sort of get this, and I don't necessarily mean it to be, I don't know, like sentimental. It's just sort of this heaviness that I don't know. I can't get rid of it. I don't really want to get rid of it either. It's like, it's because it connects me to home and it makes me feel sad, but also it doesn't take away from me. I just can't really describe it. It's this weird feeling of like homesickness and sadness, but it makes me feel fortified in a sense, because it makes me feel like, well, you have things to be sad about. So, you know what I mean? Like you have something. You have something that you feel like you've missed or you've lost, and so it's important enough for it's sort of like the sadness is like a respect for it's just sort of respecting that relationship that you have with this time and place and stuff. So for me, it doesn't necessarily feel like, oh, I wish I can get rid of this. It's more of like, it's sort of, well, this is important to you. So of course you feel this way. And isn't that a beautiful thing to have something to feel that way about? Because how many people don't? You know what I mean? How many people don't have something to feel this way about in a sense? So for me, it kind of feeds me a little bit.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised if all of the black people in this room sort of experience that sense of homelessness from time to time. Yeah. So, do Janada and Baudelaine, you want to speak to what the things that you write about, the things you don't write about, and my million Question?
I'm glad you restated it. This is Janata, because I was like, ooh, there's a lot of nooks and crannies to that question. I write about literally just all sorts of things. Like, I feel like a huge theme in my writing tends to have to do with sisterhood, and kind of thinking about actually this particular reading as well as this work I'm creating for the Pillsbury House, this like installation performance thing. A lot of it is around the witchiness of like my mother and her sisters. And like my mom, she's from Trinidad, and my father's from St. Croix, and the way they met was kind of similar to how it is in the States, where there's a lot of migration from the South up to like, you know, Chicago or Milwaukee or New York. In the Caribbean, it's from island to island. So my grandfather, my mom's father, moved from Trinidad to St. Croix when she was a teenager with Summer, her siblings. She's the oldest of 7. And before then, he'd been to other islands working, and her and her siblings would stay there, which I also realized is kind of like a component of, I think, the West Indian like experience. I think like maybe the generation of our parents who have migrated, a lot of parents leaving kids behind in the islands, you know, and kind of like this trauma that I feel like both my parents had, because both of them had parents who left them young. But anyhow, my parents met in St. Croix, where my father's from, and a couple of years later, my dad came up here and my mom came up here. And lately, I've been writing a lot about what was that jump from living in the Caribbean, where it's like, I think in a lot of ways it's these islands that represent paradise to the world, but they're still like, you know, these finite spaces, you know, that you can't leave in a car, you know, and therefore the leaving becomes maybe in the way you're talking about it, this really deep resonance, because it's not like, you know, you could keep on driving back home once you leave either. So in my work, it's really been about like, you know, this wild woman entirety that my mom and her sisters kept, and the ways that it lives in me and my sisters, you know, like 4 girls, we grew up in South Minneapolis, and my mom was a single mom, and I find like the component of like the ways that women maintain wildness, you know, so like I wrote a play last year that was all about relationships with women, you know, like the relationship between a mom who's locked up and her relationship with her daughters, a relationship with sisters, these 2 sisters, one who's dealing with trauma in a way that's very external, and one that's dealing with it very internal. And then the relationship that like I think a lot of people hopefully have like when they're teenagers and they're like meet somebody who's kind of weird or awkward or different in the way that they are, kind of like that spark kind of twin flame friend. So like, you know, I like sort of, you know, those sort of moments like where people kind of actualize themselves. So I feel like that really becomes a part of my work, whether I'm talking in a fictional sense or whether I'm, you know, writing about my own self. Like I feel like those are the moments, you know. And certainly I've been writing a lot about the women in my family.
Okay.
I'll stand up again. This is Bolen speaking. I've been influenced a lot by political issues happening in Haiti, so this is a huge part of my writing. And especially because of the way I come into writing. I remember when I was like maybe 10 or 12 years old, my father told me, or he would tell me several times, you should be a writer. You should be a writer, but why? Because you speak French so well. So, and for me, it was a struggle. The question of being bilingual and speaking French and Creole, but being a writer or choose to be a writer because you speak French. And for me, I started to find a way to write in different language, like in Creole. And so I started, my first novel was published in Haitian Creole, was written in Haitian Creole. And I think from this situation, identity question of identity, question of belonging, question of place became very important for my writing. And also, I've been always a migrant. And when I'm saying that is that because my family was involved in political issues, so often we would move from places to places, and writing became important for me because it was a way for me to find ground, to find an identity, and also to make sense of what was happening. And my last novel talks about, partly takes on the issue of migration and loss, and the ways in which these movements, these travelings, they shape us, but also the way we shape them and how it impacts our lives. Yeah, so this is mainly what I write about.
Yeah. All right, thank you. We had a potluck at my house on Janata's birthday where we just talked about, what are the things that we want to talk about publicly? We talked about things that we don't want to talk about publicly and also the things that we were okay with. And Janata, you said something that kind of blew my mind. You said our stories need to exist on their own, not as an addendum. Blackness lives in every room. Blackness is sacred. Not that it matters or that it is special, but it is sacred. And in a conversation I had with Valerie a couple of months before then, she talked about blackness as being sacred, which I think might be something that the women from the Caribbean hold in a different way than the African American women and perhaps the women from Africa, I'm not sure. But could you guys speak to that sacredness of blackness?
You looking at me to go first?
Yeah, I'm looking at
Well, I think for me, it really actually was inspired initially with the conversation of Black Lives Matter, because as, I guess, critical as it was to maintain that idea, it still felt so incomplete. It's kind of like, my kid matters. No, your kid was pushed out your body. You feed your child. There's so much more to it. It's a ritual and it's a consistent experience. And I think in the context of the diaspora and blackness in the diaspora, I feel like it gives gravy, it gives stew, it gives everything, you know what I'm saying, to how we move around and what feels sweet to us. And I feel like the work that I'd been creating was all about saturating people in an undeniability of it and an unapologetic love of it. Why is it this thing that that we all listen to hip hop, we all make love to certain Black music, we all, just that vibe, you know what I'm saying? When you walk into a space and that laughter and that you know what I'm saying? That's sacred, that's like church, and we all live it, no matter if you're Black or not. So I think for me, just that being not necessarily a preoccupation in the work as much as just it's clearly always gonna be in my work, that holding that space. And I feel certainly I think what I've really loved, so when I was in college, I studied social justice with the emphasis on the African diaspora, which was just kind of something I made up so I can travel. And it was and see where Black people were. Where are y'all? I'm from Minnesota. I think I don't know about you, Valerie, but you were born in Haiti and I was born here, and my connection to water were lakes, Lake Calhoun, Mississippi River. You know what I mean? Those are the waters, but when my parents talked about water, they talked about the sea. They talked about the ocean. They talked about the beach, And so I think for me, I think that's for me, there's a lot of magic in that experience. And I think being a woman now, it's now I feel the kid I was looking up to the women in my life, I am that woman now, if that makes any sense. Like the ways that, and maybe every woman experiences that. Like I think, you remember just looking up at women, and then all of a sudden you got a purse with randomness in it now. Like all of those things become complete, And so like I think for me now, I'm certainly just, yeah, that's the magic.
That's the
I'll
magic.
let you talk more about the sacred as far as you see it.
I like that this is Valerie. I like that you brought up water, because water is part of this sacredness for me. So I was born in Brooklyn. I go home, every time I try to go home at least once a year, but I always try to visit the beach. I always try to visit Coney Island. There's sort of like that ritual of smelling salt water and feeling the mist on my face, even if it's cold or December. It's just something about that really feeds me in a way that a lake can't. It just makes me, and I try to look at the lake so I don't see the shore behind it. See if that makes it feel better. It just, something about like the ocean just sort of being alive and moving without me having to do anything to it. It's
Wow,
everything.
yeah.
So I've been, so a lot of that, so that sort of leads to I think part of the sacredness that we were talking about in the conversation is that I've been talking about taking these really long baths lately. It's like I take these really long baths with like salt water, and I sit there and I'm like, sort of like I don't know, womb feeling, but also like this like, and then I put on like my music mix, which is all black girls. And it's just this sort of like, it becomes really like this sort of like church experience for me. Like it just feels affirming and it feeds me, and it's just sort of like a lot of what I feel like I miss in sort of moving here. So I moved here about 10 years ago. But growing up in New York, I didn't really have, that feeling of, I guess, nostalgia or loss or whatever, because, Haitianness was all around me. So if anything, I took it for granted. Like I didn't even realize how much it was feeding me. I was like, oh, it's everywhere. Hey, Haitians. Yeah, it was cool. Like it never even, until I got here and I was just like, wait, what? I'm so hungry. It just turned into this. So I've been sort of trying to create that like, kind of like black girl magic for myself here in a sense, like trying to build that community, but also build that feeling of sanctuary in a sense. And yeah, that sanctuary is just so important. So I just can't even describe it. Like it's sort of, it's like not letting somebody into, like it's really important to not let somebody who can steal your energy and take away your energy into your sanctuary. It's like trying to touch your belly button or something. I'm like, don't just get away from my belly button. It's like you need to sort of have that place where you feel like you can completely be yourself. And in this society and living here especially, not that I feel like I can't always just be myself, but it's sort of like, it's become this thing where it's like, you don't deserve to see myself. Like, I'm keeping this for me. I'm gonna go home and enjoy it and screw the rest of you, whatever. So it's sort of become this sort of like, I'm gonna protect it because every time I feel like I try to make an effort to put it out there, hey, black girl, hey, it always becomes sort of like, step back. And I'm just like, you know what? I'm gonna keep her at home with me. We're gonna celebrate, we're gonna write poems. I don't need y'all, I'm good. So it becomes this thing where it's sort of like me against the world or whatever, or me against society, but the sacredness of it for me is just so there that it's worth hiding and protecting. Yeah.
Borlin, do you want to speak to that?
The issue of blackness in Haiti, I shouldn't say that, the issue of blackness in Haiti, because I have to say that when coming here and see how this issue plays out in the United States was it was very surprising.
Yeah.
Because I never thought of myself as a black woman. As being in Haiti, I never thought of myself as being, I know I am black, but this obsession of looking at people, or this obsession of color is not really present. And that doesn't mean that we don't have issues of class, issues of discrimination in Haiti, but in different ways. And I don't know what's the experience of writing. You talk about sanctuary, you talk about like, it's like a religious space. And for me, stories, it's about selves, even if we would use different ways to get that story out. And actually, when I often write, I don't think about who's going to read my writing. Mm-hmm. And I am more aware of it being here. You know, Carolyn, where the language I write in, it's not the language that people speak. I tend to think more about it. But for me, writing is a self-expression, and this is why when I write, I think about music that makes my body dancing, and that moves me around, because this is a way for me to connect with who I am, to connect with where I come from, and what that means for me. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I think it was you, Janata, or it might have been one of the African women at the potluck who said that we have to find ourselves in literature. So why can't others find their stories in our writing? So that kind of leads to the question of, what do you think Black women should be reading?
Should they be reading?
What do you think we should be reading? There's, the whole idea of the canon, and there's also the question of, do we as Black women have a canon? Should we have one? And where do you get your inspiration from, whether it's from a canon or some other place? And anybody can just speak to that.
This is Valerie. I find my inspiration, or at least, maybe lately, I've been focusing on, African American writers who have sort of done or written in the Caribbean, in a sense. So people who have literature that cross the borders in that sort of way. Zora Neale Hurston and folks like that. It's also like, I've also been sort of focusing a lot more on Caribbean writers, of course, women, men. It's a difficult question because I feel like so much of my Caribbean writer education has happened in the older part of my life, in a sense. Because, English major, you go to school, you study all this stuff, none of them are Caribbean, okay. So now it's sort of like, I feel like I'm in a place where I'm like, all right, now I need to know about me. Like, who are my writers? Who are my folks? Who are the folks who write about the things that, because I already know all about that. Great. Chaucer, yes, okay, whatever. I need to I want to know my stuff. So I've been sort of like looking and digging, and as much as I speak French, but French writers aren't necessarily very open to me in a sense. I don't necessarily feel that comfortable I'm going to go through this French novel. Like, it'll take a bit. I've been really excited about the Creole books I've been seeing lately. They've been coming out. I'm like, this is the language that everybody speaks at home. So it's sort of like, yes. French is if you go to school and you learn French. But Creole is what everybody speaks, just on the street and everybody to each other. So it's nice to have that accessibility of language. As much as it's difficult to read, I'm much more willing to put in the effort in that than to put in the effort in some other works. So for me, I feel like I don't necessarily have a canon, but I guess I'm sort of building one in my head of things like, I'm like, this is important. Yeah, this is important. So I have a little file of folks that I think are important.
And who are some of those folks? Names,
Okay.
give us some names.
Names, okay. Well, let's see. Well, there's all the folks that, I mean, there's the current folks, of course. There's Edwige, there's Roxane Gay, there's, I've clearly read lots of like Zora Neale Hurston, Tell My Horse. That book sort of like talks about Jamaica and Haiti, and that was really interesting to me. I also read like Audre Lorde. I read Baudelaire. I don't know. And I also just read stuff that people give me, I guess, like what people see and think that I would have an interest in, and I'm just willing to sort of like, yes, I'll read this. Yes, I'll read this. I try to read a lot of my friends. It's hard to have the whole list break out right now because I'm on the spot and kind of sweaty. So list is not coming up, but it's there, and I try to sort of have an abundance of different things I can try to jump into.
Okay. Baudelaire,
I read people whose experiences speak to mine, and although we have a tendency to read the ones that are famous or the ones that people talk about, that you hear on whose names are in the radio, for me, I tend to move away from the canon, and I think even writing is very, when you as a writer, it's important to read a lot. And I like reading, and I read more than I write. I tend to read more than I write. And in this sense, for me, I find it very suspect. And I know this is how the world works. But the question that I'm asking myself, what is the purpose of building a canon, a literature of canon? And for me, exploring more of what exists, exploring more outside of this border, it's very important for me, and I go for that. So not that I tend to limit myself to only those I know, to like the Haitian or the Caribbean writers. But in a way, let's forget about the canon. Whose stories out there and we don't have the chance to connect with. And then I think when we talk about canon, often it's about putting aside other stories that are important. So in this sense, I'm very, my readings experiences are kind of spread out.
yeah.
Who I read.
Yeah, I read.
This is Janata.
This is Janata. I read everything. Like, I was best homies with the librarian since I was a kid. Like, I love books. I feel like since I moved back, I used to live in New York for a couple of years, and I got to read a lot because I had a long train commute. But since living here, I don't read as much as I used to read, but I feel like I like Black science fiction writers, I like surreal things. I like, but talking about the canon, I think what troubles me around the idea of a canon is that folks who weren't white men weren't considered canonizable, so to even think about, us in the canon, it's like, well, the house wasn't built for us, But I do love the canon of my life, which I think is like my mom's voice when she's yelling at me. Just different sort of like songs that people love to play on the block. Being on the bus is a canon, just the ways people talk. The way people talk. Like, I think from when I was young, I was actually just thinking about this recently. So me and a friend were talking about Bill Withers. And he has there's a bomb documentary about him. Maybe it's on Netflix though, who knows? But he stuttered, here's this brilliant singer, brilliant songwriter who stuttered, and their stuttering is very much a big trait in my mom's side of the family. And I have an uncle who has a very significant stutter. And I used to just love hearing him speak so much as a kid. Just loved the ways that like he just like would just bubble and bounce around the words, but also knowing it was a thing that he really tried to suppress. I even remember like when I was a teenager, and because I've always, you know, been like kind of that kid who's the teachers are like, come on, say something, you talk, and you feel confident with yourself. And I remember he was just like, oh gosh, like I look up to you, Janata, because when I was in high school, like he was a good student, but when he wouldn't show up was when he had to speak publicly, you know? So anyways, I just kind of say that to think about like the ways that like, in Blackness, I think this is all over, because I think literacy and Blackness has always been a thing that's been separated. And our literacy is so transcendent of what whiteness says literacy is. Like our literacy in navigating this world is tremendous, right? So like really thinking about like the literacy that I got to be around was just like, you know, the certain music with bass that my parents played, and, you know, I don't know, just the way kids from other cultures, like, you know, Black kids from Chicago, I used to love the way they spoke. And I used to try to talk like them, because it was like, oh, you talk proper, you know, or you talk white. That's what, you know, I would hear that too. But for me, it's like, I loved it all, you know? So I think when I think of canon, specifically as far as my inspiration, and mind you, like, I mean, I read, you know, there is Ruby, gosh, what was her name, this one writer? Rosa Guy.
Oh, yeah.
That was the first West Indian writer I ever read. And that for me was really amazing to see characters that were West Indian. Like that to me was just like, or Caribbean. I mean, I still use West Indian. But just to hear in the book, people talk like my mom. Whereas like for me, like all the books I would read would be like, you know, in books I loved, but they didn't sound like my family. And then when I would actually read Caribbean writers and hear like patois in the book, you know, which I think is why, you know, obviously, you know, Zora Neale Hurston was such a huge deal, is that she was just like, nah, the language is what we speak, not what is forced upon us, you know. So, and I think hip hop is a huge part of what a canon is, you know what I mean? The ways MCs, and I think for me that's a huge part of like how my brain thinks around words and language. Like I'm always trying to freestyle in my writing, even if it's not, even if it's a play, even if it's a short story, it's a freestyle, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's canon. That's
Yeah,
the canon.
yeah. Yeah. So before we go to questions, Janata, could you name some of the Black sci-fi and speculative fiction writers?
Tananarive Due, she's cool. And there's so many doper. Like, don't, if it's on me, like for a Google, like you don't need me. But, obviously Octavia Butler, Ben Okri is dope. Jill Gomez.
Oh, okay.
She does some sci-fi. There's this really good book that's called Dark Matter. That's like an anthology of Black sci-fi writers. And there's like, and that was written like, what, that was like a decade ago or more. There's way more, you know, Google.
It works.
It works.
Okay, so we have time for a few questions, but I also want to thank Zinzelli for reading the poem at the beginning of the that was awesome. Thank you. And expanding our education about the diaspora. All right. Questions? Hi.
I have a question for Baudelaire. My question is for, well, it could be for all three of you, but particularly for Baudelaire, because you were raised in Haiti and didn't have a sense of identity as being Black, separate from other people in your community. How are you seeing your own children's perception of race? Because they've spent the last 5 years in the United States. So a lot of who they are is being formed by this society and this culture. And I'm just curious about what you're seeing with their experiences.
Yeah, thank you, Pat, for this question. Wow, you know, we often say that children speak the truth, right? We came here, I think it was end of 2009, and yeah, and we had to stay here for several reasons. And one of the observations that my daughter, she was at that time maybe 3 years old, and she said, wow, these people are pink. I don't know why they are calling them white. and, and recently, she's a fourth grader, and I requested that the school put them in a particular classroom. And so my son, he's a first grader, and he has a black African-American teacher. And when he came home and he would report about his first day, and he would keep asking my daughter, what's the skin color of your teacher? And my daughter would say, well, it doesn't matter. Why do you want to know? I'm not telling you. And I was surprised by her reaction. And I sent an email to my friend Pat asking her, this is what happened, and I don't even know how to answer her. And again, the issues come up, and my son was really insistent and asking, what's the skin color of your teacher? And he said, you have to find out. I'm not going to tell you. So these are issues that have happened with my kids, and that tells me they have a way of looking at what's happening. And that means also the way we perceive race, the way we talk about it, and the incidents that happen frequently in our lives, whether at personal or at a macro level, they receive that as well, and they have a way of translating it. And of course, having a young child, a black boy, I worry a lot. I worry a lot, and yeah, I don't know. Yeah, and although we don't live this issue, we live it differently in Haiti because we are all black. And so we don't talk about who's black and who's not. But as much as I try to teach my children about being open and accepting differences, I know also they have to be aware of the cost of living here, of being black here, and that I don't know how to translate that well to them, but yeah, it's a learning.
Yeah, wow. Another question? Conise?
My name's Conise. I grew up in South Minneapolis, and there was a family that I grew up with who were Jamaican, and they would pick the girls, there were 3 girls, they would pick me up every day, and they would jingle down the street, and I was always jealous of them because they had culture, and the way I defined the culture, they wore bangles, and they had pierced ears, and they had calypso music, and their parents spoke in an accent, Jamaican accent, that I couldn't necessarily always understand because their parent, her dad in particular, their dad spoke very quickly, fast. But I've noticed, and this sounds like a stereotype, but I've seen it so consistently that I believe it's true, that children that come from the Caribbean culture have more pride. I've seen this pride. I even saw a 2-year-old get on the bus with this very straight back, and her head was held so high, and her, I was like, that's a little Caribbean child. And so finally I went to Jamaica because I'm like, I want to see this. Plus it's kind of like my dream culture that I should have been born, but I wasn't. And I think what you were speaking about, the fact everyone is black, well, of course in Jamaica there's different races of people, but most people are black. And just growing up, even in Chicago, you can go miles and miles and miles and never see a white person. And there's a difference, even in Chicago, people that come here, that they have grown up seeing people in so many different professions and do so well. business owners, and they have a different type of pride. And in the book, The Friends by Rosa Guy, I love that book. I've read it over and over and over and over again, and you could kind of even see the different, the way there was a difference in African-American culture and how these two friends interacted. So I don't really have a question. I just wanted to chat. Okay, so I guess I'm gonna make up a question. Do you feel that, or can you see that difference, or the pride maybe that you experience? Maybe you can't feel it or see it because it's you, but do you think I'm imagining this?
Not at all. Let's say that it's a way of being, and I, as a Caribbean, I can speak to that. And what the story you just shared, and I can relate it to what you said. I traveled with Zenzele, which is a professor at the U of M, recently in Haiti. And we visited a university, and after visiting this place, and she would tell me, wow, they take their study so seriously, and you see how they space it. You can speak to that, but I think when we are into something, we really go deep into it, and yeah.
I mean, this is Janata. So, I don't know. Well, okay, so I went to Trinidad for the first time 2 years ago. That's where my mother's from. And I think even the difference between my growing up here in Minnesota, being like, a black kid in a very white culture, and my mom growing up in Trinidad in a culture where there was like everybody in power. Like I remember going in the airport and every frame picture of someone important was a black person. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there's just like that range. And I think like in islands where everything is concentrated and small, I feel like I see different kinds of pride and all kinds of blackness and all kinds of people. So I wouldn't necessarily, and maybe I don't see the nuances much, I do feel like there's different vibes, but I certainly feel like I see a lot of like black American sisters who are just like flame and fly and have like this like element to them that is just like, really powerful and hardworking and proud. Mm-hmm. And I feel like, there certainly is something about an immigrant experience about the people who end up persevering. It's like there's certain kinds of personalities who leave everything they know, you know what I mean, to make something new, for their lives, So there certainly is I feel like different flavors as far as my experience. Yeah.
Valerie? Mm-hmm.
This is Valerie. For me, especially growing up, one thing my parents always told me, it's like, you come from the first Black Republic. So that's always been like, yeah. Especially when everybody wants to tell you like, you're this, you're that, you're not good enough, you're whatever. It's like, look, first Black Republic, I don't have and you think about the time period where it happens, and then it's like, and as much as it's like, even now, like people, will talk about like, well, the situation in Haiti isn't great, and and there's these issues, and I'm like, yes, many issues, lots of different issues, but it's also sort of like freedom. I mean, it's like freedom. I mean, it's as much as it's difficult and as much as it's hard. Everybody has problems and everybody has issues. Every country does, but I'd still rather deal with my issues within my own group, in a sense. So it's sort of like growing up in that, it never really felt like I had anything to be. I mean, and it's not like it was necessarily easy. Like I had, classmates who tease you, and kids would make fun of you and say things about your ribbons, and because you always had ribbons, lots and lots of ribbons in our hair, lots of ribbons. And there's always some sort of issue, but it's always like you also came home and it was like, okay, the Republic of Haiti. This is where I am. this is the country I'm in. Inside that was I open the door and walk in. This is the country I'm in. These are the rules that we have. These are the people who are in charge, and everybody sort of had a role. It's like your job, go to school, do great. That's all you have to do. Just do it. My job, I have to make money and make sure that you eat. His job is to make sure that we all stay in the house. Like, just so everybody sort of had like a role in a sense, and all of the roles felt important. Like they were all very crucial to make the machine of the house work in a sense. So I've always felt like there's sort of like, for me, I've always felt this pride and this within myself. Because we were even talking earlier about like, I've been writing since I was like 8 years old. Because something about me felt like, well, I have to write these things because people need to know about this stuff. Whatever it is that I'm writing about, it was like, I was always sort of interested in history in that way of sort of like, well, one day this will be an artifact and people will need to know about how I lived. Why not? Yes. It's really important. And to me, it just always seemed like it was never like, it was never a question about it. So it was just, so I guess that pride comes from there. My parents always just, telling us about the history, and every Sunday it's like, okay, we're gonna eat dinner, and my mother started telling us like, let me tell you about, how we won our independence, and I'm like, okay, again, yes, let's hear it again. And she'd tell the story again, and then she'd stop at the parts that are dramatic, and then she'd talk about the other parts, and then she'd quote all the different people with the swords and the blood and and also that revolution was just so unapologetic. Like it was so not, we're just gonna try and get rid of some people. Like nah, cut and burn. We're gonna raise this whole place if we have to. Everybody has to go. Like, and it was just sort of, and that sort of like no, like Hulk smash, like just that whole like it just has to sort of be done. Just really for me is really. I don't know, for me, it just makes me feel really proud. Like, for me, it just always feels like, yes. Like, none of that, like, well, we're going to half-step, maybe we'll negotiate. It's like, no. Yeah. Cut it all out. Because sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes you just got to start all over. I always feel like there's always this element of sort of like, we need to sort of try and figure out how to work together. And it's like, yes, in a way, yes. But in a way, sometimes you just got to throw the whole thing out and just start over. But that's what they did.
Okay, we have time for one more, and that I saw Adobe first.
I'm trying to, so I have a question around storytelling and around perspective. Like I'm trying to recognize the space that we're in, that this conversation is being held at. We're using words like the canon, and I feel as a Nigerian writer, as an African writer, like I feel I don't know if it's the same for Caribbean, but the idea of a canon is not necessarily, it's a very westernized term. So, but what I do know is storytelling. And so to talk about, from each of your perspectives, the kind of storytelling you grew up with. We talked about language already and how that filtered into storytelling, but what those other elements and how it worked into your artwork, whether that was writing, whether that was performing, whether that be the case. To talk a little bit about that, and to also kind of talk about, I mean, if this conversation was happening not in this country, like if we were to move this conversation elsewhere, like how, I'm just trying to imagine how this conversation would be moving if we weren't centered in a very Western ideal. So storytelling and that you should talk about placements, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Oh, well, this is Valerie. I'll start. I wasn't sure who wanted to start.
No, go ahead. I want to give it up.
Storytelling is, my whole life. Like, you grow up around so many different types of stories. Uncles tell stories, aunties, my mom, my dad. My dad would always have this joke about my mom telling a story. He's like, all her stories start with, that cemetery up by the hill, close to the church? Every single story of my mom starts that way. But she would just always have this sort of like, but it always has like place in it and like different, so things are sort of the relationship of places next to each other, and then she would sort of go into the sort of whatever the other stories are. So much folklore, a lot of history, and I guess that's why I'm also like kind of like a news junkie. I'm really into sort of like historical things that happen and how they relate to the rest of history and how they all affect all of us. As much as we like to act like, no, those are separate and that's in the past. It's like, no, that's today. It's, for me, storytelling, I think that's what I miss the most, actually. My mom was here for like a month, and like literally I just sat there and like recorded her and just listened to her tell stories all day, because that's all she wanted to do. And I was just like, yes, all right, this is great, summer vacation. And she just tells stories about like, what the priest did the other day, what happened here. And it was just always, it's always so like rich too, because it's never just like, oh, the priest did this. It's like this real big buildup of like, what she wore, where she was going, the time of day, the weather was like, you get to this place and then he's here, but then his attitude felt like this and she was thinking about that, but they didn't say anything yet, and you're like, wow. It's so involved, and I love it. It's just so awesome. And I find myself, like, I don't necessarily have any children, but I tend to sort of try and work things out by talking to myself sometimes. And so my dog's always looking at me like, what are you talking about? Are these orders for me? Are you trying to tell me something? You're not looking at me. Yeah, and of course my husband hears all of my stories constantly on repeat. I think storytelling is like the lifeblood of the culture in a sense. Like you share all of these different stories over and over again. I even think about like when I was younger, my relatives, like my uncle would get tapes from Haiti of people just talking and telling stories because they didn't know how to write to each other, and there was really no way to really mail things, and so you'd give a tape to somebody, and then you'd listen to it over and over again. You're just listening to this tape, like, this is what happened this day, and this is what's going on here, and this is what we need money for, and this is what we're trying to fix, and this is what other thing that happened. It's just hearing the voices from across the water. Love it, love it.
Okay.
Storytelling, it's interesting what you're saying about just like parents telling stories, because as a kid, I remember the first time I was aware my mom had an accent. I was in the lunch line, like I remember vividly, I was in the lunch line in 2nd grade, and this girl going like, I love your mom's accent. I was like, my mom doesn't have an accent. Because in my mind, like I understood everything she said. She sounded like her, and she's my mom. But now as a grown woman, there's just ways that like my mom talks that like now I'm really realizing, yeah, similarly, there's just like, actually part of my reading, I'm gonna share a snippet of my mom just talking, and the way she be talking. And it's always so like, and I mean, just to give a juxtaposition, I remember one time, so I have a younger sister who has a different mom who's Norwegian and from Wisconsin. We have the same daddy, you do the math. But I remember one time my mom was telling a story to my little sister, and she's very much like my mom is like, and then, like it's total participation, So I showed up to this place, and the person who's listening to the story has to be like, really the place? You know what I mean? But I remember in this conversation, my little sister the whole time didn't do the back and forth that my mom needed to ump the ante of the story. You know what I'm saying? So it's kind of like, it's like, yo, we going on this journey. So I think for me, just like in that instant, just like really appreciating and really recognizing. I think just kind of explaining, like, in some ways it's like telling a fish to be aware of water, because so much of it is stories. Like, I really felt like I'd been to the islands for a good part of my childhood just because everything was that conversation. Everything. I remember, and I mean, another quick story. My mom was telling me about her great aunt, her, I guess her grandmother's, it don't matter, her great aunt. And she was like, yeah, she had to go beat this man's ass who beat up, this other aunt or what have you. And I was like, Mom, were you there? She's like, no, that happened before I was born. But the way she was telling the story was that, like, like she'd been there. And I was just thinking that a story can be so notorious that people are talking about it like they was there when they weren't even born yet. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah.
We don't have time. We don't have time for any more questions. I'm sorry. Baudelaine, did you want to speak to that too?
Actually, I would like to hear her question if it's okay.
You want to hear a question? Well, okay, let's do it like this. Can it be quick, and can your responses be quick? Because we need to take a break.
Yes.
And when we're done with the break, those who can stay, we're going to hear them read. And for those of you who can't stay, we thank you for coming. All right, quick one.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing the space today. Very quick story and quick question. I was in a space with Black women in a talk back after a spoken word performance last spring when a young woman said, sometimes I forget I have a body. And I wondered if you guys could speak to the different spaces that you feel disembodied within, and where does that get held in your own body? And wondering if this impacts your writing and the different ways in which you start to surround yourself with the healing to get back to the words, to get back to the page, and if that's been an experience and a development of both your identity as a writer, but also your sense of self and worth.
That is not going to be a quick response.
Such a good question, though.
It's a great question, and it's a whole program in itself. But does...
Real quick. I have a one-word answer. Work is where I feel like I don't. Yeah, that's where I'm not in my body when I'm at work. Yes.
Yeah, I've been feeling pretty disembodied lately, actually, and it's really been work to be in my body. I go to the park, and TMI, but I don't wear underwear, and I sit on the earth. And I've really been like being in my body because I think so much of society is in your head, and your head ain't nowhere. It's nowhere.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's just like, and I just feel like, you know, for me, it's like I've really been trying to like just get like literally like I think my womb, you know, like my hips, my heart, you know, is certainly where I feel like in escape mode, and I certainly feel like it impacts my writing, because once I write, I'm keeping it so real with myself, and if I'm keeping it real with myself, then I'm gonna have to do something different. So, you know, yeah.
I've been thinking lately that if I had to choose another a profession, something to do in another life, it would be being a dancer. And I don't know if it has to do with the fact that the society I grew, that I'm living in a space now that this is not where I grew up, or the fact that I am very busy. But for me, writing or creating a space to write, it's a very important moment for me. And sometimes I write, I lay down, and I want to feel alive. And sometimes I write, I want to feel that I am at the center of the world, that I matter. And the way for me to feel that is to feel that I am me. And in this sense, and I was showing earlier that sometimes for the words to move, I need to move. For the words to come, for me to progress, to go through the story that I am writing, I need to run. I need to feel my body, and I think that's been very important for me as a way of finding myself, as a way of connecting with what I'm going through and sharing a story.